Carlos Vance stood on the sidewalk and watched the locksmith replace the deadbolts on the house he had paid off over 32 long years. Behind him on the porch stood Claire and Robert, clutching the papers they had tricked him into signing just days before. They had his transfer documents and his account forms, which meant every cent he had saved for retirement and medical emergencies was gone. In a single afternoon, his own children had emptied his life's work into their own bank accounts. His old pickup truck sat idling at the curb with his entire life piled into the back. There were boxes of clothes, a lamp his wife picked out back in 1987, and a few hand tools he couldn't leave behind. Everything else he owned had been labeled as trash, and they treated him with the exact same lack of respect. The neighbors were all out on their lawns watching the humiliation unfold. Mr. Henderson stood by his fence, while the family across the street leaned against their garage, witnessing the exact moment Carlos Vance was stripped of his dignity. Robert didn't even try to lower his voice when he joked about his father finally learning to live within his means. That laughter felt like a physical weight in Carlos's chest, but he didn't say a word. He simply climbed into his truck and drove away from the only home he knew. But there was one thing his children had overlooked in their greed. 40 years ago, back when Carlos was a master welder making a small fortune, he had purchased a plot of industrial land 15 miles outside the city limits. He had big plans for that lot once, but then life and mortgages and kids got in the way. The dream had been buried under decades of hard work until he forgot it existed entirely. Because the property taxes were paid automatically from a tiny trust account, the vultures had missed it when they picked his life clean. The property sat right where the city's industrial sprawl gave way to the empty, quiet plains. When Carlos finally parked his truck and stepped out, he was met with a silence so deep it felt like stepping back in time. It was the kind of quiet you only hear when you're young enough to think the world is a fair place. At first glance, the lot looked like a graveyard for dead dreams and broken machinery. Rusted welding frames and hydraulic presses that hadn't moved in 30 years sat sinking into the dirt. Old metal drums were corroded down to nothing, but right in the center of the mess, a massive shape rose 40 feet into the gray sky. Carlos looked up at the water tank and remembered the name he gave it a lifetime ago, the Iron Goliath. It was a giant cylindrical tank, like the ones you see in old factories, covered in orange rust and peeling paint. While most people would see a piece of junk, Carlos looked at it with a welder's eye and saw that the bones were still good. The structure hadn't buckled or collapsed, and even though the metal was thin in some spots, it was an honest kind of wear that a man could fix. He was only 32 when he bought this land, with hands that knew how to build and a head full of ambition. He had planned to build a workshop or a warehouse that actually meant something, but time has a way of swallowing those ideas if you aren't careful. During that first week, he started clearing the debris by hand and sorting the scrap metal into neat piles. His body was tired, but his hands remembered the rhythm of the work, even if he had forgotten how it felt to have a purpose. By the time the second week rolled around, he had managed to find some old equipment in a shed to seal the biggest leaks in the tank. He used salvaged metal patches to bridge the gaps, and while the work looked rough, it was solid enough to hold. At night, he would sit in the long shadow of the Goliath and watch the sun dip below the skyline. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't mourning what his family had stolen. He was looking at that rusted metal and wondering what else might be hidden in the dust. Inside the rusted belly of the tank, Carlos started building a life from the leftovers of the world. He constructed a sleeping platform using scrap wood and metal grating, making sure it stayed high enough to keep him off the freezing floor. To make it sturdy, he reinforced the frame with angle iron he'd scavenged from the yard, then topped it with foam padding found in a dumpster 5 miles away. The work took him 2 full days to finish, but he didn't mind the labor because doing it right was the only thing that mattered. To get power, he ran a single extension cord from a pole at the property line in a risky, jury-rigged setup. He managed to coax a broken generator back to life, which gave him enough electricity to run a small lamp and a single hot plate. It was just enough to boil water for his morning coffee or heat up something simple to eat when the sun went down. Some nights, dinner was just a can of salty soup, while other times it was nothing more than hot water and a dry piece of bread. The tank was a lonely place that echoed every time he moved. Every sound bounced off those curved metal walls and came back to him louder than before, making the rain sound like a crowd applauding. When the wind picked up, it sounded like the building was breathing, and his own footsteps felt like a ghost walking in circles through the wreckage of his past. At night, as he lay on his platform, he listened to the metal sing to itself with a low hum that felt almost peaceful. It didn't take long for word to spread through the neighborhood about the old man living in the water tank. They called him the Hermit and the Failure, and the man who owned the scrapyard next door, Mr. Henderson, started treating him like a sideshow attraction. Henderson would bring people by on the weekends just so they could point and laugh while taking photos for their social media pages. They posted cruel jokes and tagged him as the Hermit of the Tank, making sure the insults were loud enough for him to hear. Carlos never gave them the reaction they wanted because he had learned a hard truth after his children threw him out. He realized that shame only has power if you accept it, or if you start believing the lies that other people are writing about your life. He had stopped believing their story the very moment he drove away from his old home with nothing but his pride. He stuck to a strict routine because having a schedule is the only thing that keeps a man sane when he's living inside a rusted cylinder. His mornings were dedicated to maintenance, walking the perimeter to check the seals and listening to the metal for any new rust that might cause a problem. In the afternoons, he would head over to Henderson's yard to look for supplies, and the owner let him take whatever he wanted just for the entertainment of watching an old man find value in trash. When evening came, Carlos would sit outside the tank in total solitude to watch the sun disappear behind the horizon. He spent those hours thinking about Claire and Robert, remembering the life he had built for them and the many sacrifices he had made along the way. He thought about the meals he skipped so they could eat better, and the dreams he buried just to pay for their college educations. It was hard to wrap his head around how quickly they decided he was disposable, or how easily they signed the papers that stripped him of everything he owned. One morning, everything changed while he was scrubbing the heavy iron floor to lay down a rug he'd found in the trash. His brush caught on something that wasn't a crack or a patch of rust, but something that felt deliberate and man-made. It was a perfectly straight line etched into the metal, and his experienced welder's hands knew immediately that this wasn't accidental damage. He started clearing away decades of thick grime while his heart began to race in his chest. As the brush moved, it revealed a recessed handle and a heavy, circular seal that had been hidden for years. In that single, quiet moment, Carlos finally understood that he wasn't living in a water tank at all. His hands were shaking as he reached out to grab the heavy metal handle. It felt cold and real in a way that nothing else had felt since the day his children emptied his bank accounts and left him with nothing. He began to crank the handle slowly, bracing himself for the resistance of years of rust and corrosion. Instead of a grinding sound, there was a sudden, sharp hiss of air. It was the sound of pressure equalizing, much like a submarine coming to the surface after a long journey underwater. It felt as if something had been holding its breath for decades and was finally being allowed to breathe again. The circular seal broke free with a heavy thud, and as Carlos pulled it back, a deep darkness revealed itself. But as he looked closer, he realized the darkness wasn't empty because soft amber lights were glowing along the concrete walls. The fact that they were still functioning after all this time meant there was power and a clear intention behind the design. These lights were a sign that someone had built this place to last, and they had built it with a very specific purpose in mind. Carlos started his descent carefully, keeping one hand on the railing while he gripped a flashlight in the other. He noticed the stairs were impossibly clean, with no dust or debris to be found anywhere in the stairwell. There were no signs of decay or abandonment, suggesting that whoever sealed this place intended for it to stay perfectly preserved. When he reached the bottom, he found a heavy steel door with faded lettering stenciled across the front. It read, "Project Aegis, authorized personnel only," and the date at the bottom said 1962. That was a lifetime ago, long before Claire or Robert were even born, and before Carlos had ever considered buying the property above. This place had been sitting here in total silence, waiting for someone to find it. The door opened with a mechanical hiss, and Carlos stepped into a world that looked like it had been frozen in time. The bunker was massive, spanning 3,000 square feet with a mid-century design that looked like something out of an old magazine. It was the kind of place people built during the height of the Cold War when everyone was living in fear. He saw leather furniture that was still soft to the touch, and a library filled with thousands of books on wooden shelves. There were medical supplies kept in sealed cases, all of them labeled and organized with the kind of precision you only see in the military. The kitchen was stocked with canned goods in perfect rows, and he could still read the rotation dates on the labels. He found thick glass jars filled with dried beans, rice, and sugar, all of it looking as fresh as the day it was packed. Carlos walked through the rooms like a man caught in a dream he didn't want to wake up from. The air felt cool and filtered, kept fresh by systems that had been running silently for decades to keep the bunker alive. Everything was exactly where it had been left, preserved and waiting for a moment just like this. It felt as if someone had designed this entire room specifically for a man who had nowhere else to go. Carlos found the vault tucked along the back wall, and it was a massive steel door fitted with a mechanical combination lock. This was the kind of hardware that didn't need a single drop of electricity to work, meaning it would still function perfectly even when everything else in the world failed. He approached the heavy door slowly, moving with the same caution you use when you realize something is about to change your life forever. It took him over an hour of trial and error to get anywhere, and he spent that time listening closely for the tiny clicks of the tumblers. He moved the dial through every possible number with steady hands, because this was the kind of patient work a man learns when he has nothing left but time and a reason to keep trying. When the lock finally gave way with a heavy click, the door swung open to reveal the secret Edward Hargrove had left behind. Gold bars were stacked there in careful rows, and there were at least 20 of them arranged with the same military precision as the rest of the bunker. But the gold wasn't the only thing inside, because he also found a pile of paperwork including deeds, trust documents, and a single letter. The envelope was marked "To the new owner" and dated all the way back to 1962, and Carlos opened it with hands that weren't quite steady anymore. The letter explained the whole story, revealing that this was a Cold War bunker built by a wealthy industrialist who was convinced a nuclear war was coming. Hargrove was a defense contractor who saw threats in every shadow, so he built this sanctuary because he couldn't find a way to build peace in the world outside. The tank sitting above them was actually a disguised ventilation system, and the bunker itself was meant to be a refuge that was stocked, sealed, and eventually forgotten. Hargrove passed away in 1975, and while his estate was a tangled mess, an automated trust had been set up to pay the property taxes every single year. Because of the way those legal documents were structured, ownership transferred to the current property holder when the last beneficiary died in 1998. That meant the legal owner of the land, the gold, and the sanctuary was now Carlos. He sat down in one of the old leather chairs and let himself cry. And these weren't quiet tears, but the kind of heavy sobbing that shakes your entire body. He had spent months believing the lies his children told him about being worthless, but the universe had just stepped in to prove them wrong in the most spectacular way possible. For the next few weeks, Carlos kept his mouth shut and maintained his cover while the neighbors continued to mock him as the Hermit of the tank. He let them think whatever they wanted, but every night he descended into the bunker to explore and repair the machines with his welder's hands. He found old YouTube tutorials on his phone to help him understand the maintenance manuals, and slowly, he brought the water filtration and the electrical grid back to life. When he finally got the generator running in the sealed room, the lights brightened and the air conditioning hummed, making the whole bunker feel alive again. He cleaned every surface and corner with a sense of duty because he felt like he was reclaiming something lost that had been waiting specifically for him. There was a bedroom with a bed that was still perfectly made after 60 years, and when he lay in it that first night, he realized he hadn't slept that well in months. The bunker was quiet and safe in a way the tank never could be, and it felt like a home that actually cared about him. As he dug through the filing cabinets, he found blueprints and logs that told the story of Edward Hargrove, a man whose old fears had become another man's salvation. Carlos started to see the strange geometry of his own life. From the tank he bought on a whim 40 years ago to the land he'd nearly forgotten. Even the betrayal by his children felt like a necessary step that led him to this exact moment. and he realized that everything he'd endured was just the path to this hidden door. On a Saturday morning, Claire's car pulled up to the property with Robert sitting in the passenger seat. They had heard the whispers traveling through the neighborhood about how Carlos looked healthier and was wearing clean clothes, and those rumors made them feel hungry and calculating again. They approached the tank with a new kind of caution, moving the way people do when they realize they might have underestimated someone. Claire was the first one to speak, and her voice was smooth and practiced as she told him they had been worried about his well-being. She claimed they made a mistake because they were upset about money, and Robert nodded along, suggesting they could reverse the transfers and give him a little bit of his life back. Carlos just stood there in the shadow of the tank, and he didn't offer them a seat or even a glass of water while he waited for them to finish. "You want to know what I found here?" he said, his voice quiet but incredibly steady. He told them he had found something they couldn't steal, and something they didn't even know existed. And then he handed them a stack of legal documents. It was an injunction signed by a judge, along with a notice for a civil suit involving elder fraud and financial exploitation. Their faces turned a sickly shade of white, which is the color people turn when they realize the consequences of their actions are finally catching up to them. Carlos looked them in the eye and told them exactly how they had tricked him into signing papers he didn't understand just to make him feel worthless. He then pulled out a final document showing a deed transfer, but it wasn't going back to his children. He had signed everything over to the children's hospital in the next county to start a foundation for pediatric care, and he did it on his own terms and by his own choice. Claire tried to find the words to argue, but Carlos held up his hand to silence her before she could start. He reminded them that they once had a father who loved them and a home that provided security, but they threw all of that away for money they didn't even need. He pointed toward their car and told them to leave and never come back, because his lawyer would be the only person they'd be talking to from now on. They walked back to their car in total silence, and Robert didn't even have the nerve to try and argue as they pulled away. Claire looked back one last time, but Carlos was already walking toward the entrance of his tank and didn't bother to watch them disappear down the road. The news traveled through the neighborhood like a brush fire, jumping from house to house until the whole block was talking. People finally realized the man they called a hermit wasn't a hermit at all, but someone who had discovered something truly extraordinary right under their noses. He was a man who had managed to outsmart his own children, and as the truth came out, he was the one getting the last laugh. By the end of the week, there wasn't a soul in town who hadn't heard the rumors about the gold bars and that hidden Cold War bunker. The story grew larger every time someone retold it, getting twisted and polished by the very neighbors who had watched him suffer for months. Those same people who used to laugh at him or post mocking photos online suddenly found they couldn't even look him in the eye. One afternoon, Mr. Henderson walked up to him, but his voice sounded completely different than it had before. He seemed nervous and spoke with a newfound respect because the lease on his scrapyard was coming up for renewal soon. Since Carlos owned the land the business sat on, Henderson offered to triple the rent just to make sure he could stay. He was essentially betting his entire future on Carlos being a forgiving man. Carlos agreed to the deal, but he had one specific condition that wasn't about money. "You're going to apologize," Carlos told him firmly, "and you're going to do it publicly, so the whole neighborhood knows exactly what happened here." Henderson actually followed through with it at a community meeting the next week, standing up to tell the story without trying to hide the ugly parts. He didn't minimize the betrayal or the way the children had tried to steal their father's life savings. He laid it all out, from the hidden tank to the bunker, showing everyone how one man had turned a season of humiliation into total vindication. After that meeting, the way people looked at Carlos shifted, and you could see the shame on the faces of those who had joined in the laughter. Others seemed to find a bit of inspiration in his story, realizing that being down on your luck doesn't have to be a permanent state of being. A few neighbors even started approaching him in private to ask for advice about their own family heartbreaks. Carlos would just sit and listen to them, never pretending to have all the answers, but acknowledging that while betrayal is a heavy burden, survival is always possible. Through all of this, Carlos never gloated or tried to rub his good fortune in anyone's face. He simply lived his life in this new reality where he was finally respected, secure, and at peace for the first time in decades. He started a foundation with a quiet sense of dignity, using his wealth to fund scholarships for kids whose families were struggling to get by. He focused his energy on helping people in crisis, especially the elderly who had been pushed aside and treated like they were disposable. He became the kind of man his children never deserved to have as a father, proving he was the person he had always been, just finally free from the weight of their greed. The bunker stayed his private secret, and his lawyer was the only other person who knew the way inside. Carlos would go down there at night to sit in that old leather chair and read by the soft amber light of the lamps. It was more than just a room to him. It was a sanctuary and a quiet piece of proof that the world sometimes rewards those who can endure the most. 5 years went by before Claire finally reached out with a single email that didn't even have a subject line. She asked if they could meet, and when they sat down together in a quiet coffee shop, she finally told him the truth about why they did it. She admitted that she and Robert had been living in fear, terrified that they would never be as successful as their father or measure up to his legacy. In their desperation, they tried to break him down to nothing because they thought making him small would make them feel powerful. "It didn't work," she confessed to him with tears in her eyes. "We just ended up becoming smaller people ourselves." Carlos sat there and listened to her, and while he didn't offer forgiveness right away, he did appreciate that she was finally being honest. That truth mattered more to him than any apology she could have rehearsed. He decided to tell her about the bunker, not because he wanted to hurt her with what she'd missed out on, but because he wanted her to understand who he really was. He told her that he was never the weak man she thought she saw, and while she wasn't the daughter he hoped for, that didn't mean they couldn't try to build something better. He didn't hand her a check or offer her a shortcut to wealth, but he did give her a job working at his foundation. It was a chance for her to do honest, meaningful work and rebuild her own life on her own terms. Claire took the offer, and over time, a new kind of relationship started to grow between them. It wasn't the same as it was when she was a child, but it was something real and built on a foundation of truth. Robert never did reach out to his father, and Carlos eventually stopped waiting for the phone to ring. He had come to understand that some doors stay closed for a reason, and some people simply choose to stay on the outside. As the years passed, the bunker remained exactly the way Carlos had found it on that first day. It was a time capsule and a sanctuary that reminded him every day how fragile safety can be. Even as he grew older and started using a cane to get around, he still made the trip down there regularly. He would sit in that leather chair and remember the man he used to be before he found his way home. Sometimes his thoughts would drift to Edward Hargrove, the man who built this place for a future he never got to see. It was strange to think that one man's fear had become another man's salvation, but that was just the way fate worked. He thought about how the smallest decisions made decades ago can change everything, like how a piece of land bought in a hurry can eventually become a person's lifeline. He realized then that sometimes the act of running away is the very thing that leads you back to where you belong. Carlos discovered more than just a concrete room beneath that old rusted tank, because in that moment, he finally found his worth. The world tried its best to bury him under the weight of betrayal, but they forgot that Carlos was a builder who spent his entire life welding broken things back together. It was only right that he would eventually use those same hands to rebuild his own life when everything else had fallen apart. The tank still stands on that property, and the bunker is still waiting for what comes next. Stay with me and subscribe to see what happens when the people who were cast aside finally get their miracle.